The evacuation of the British Army at Dunkirk was an act of desperation, but it was also an act of survival and an act of defiance. The British Army had been saved, but their equipment had been lost, captured by the Germans. But the rescue of the British Expeditionary Force was nothing short of remarkable. The Battle of Dunkirk may have been a defeat for the British, but they managed to salvage a lot of pride, not to mention their entire army. It really was one of the great military escapes in history. The entire country of Great Britain pulled together to save these men. And the heroic tale of the little ships would never be forgotten. In just 9 days, 338,000 soldiers would be saved from the German army. The Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, even civilians, everyone pulled together to save the British Expeditionary Force. And the risks in crossing the Channel were high. If you weren't sunk by U-boats, you could be sunk by Stuka dive bombers. The RAF weren't often seen and were heavily criticised, but they were there, giving protection to the men on the beach, drawing the fighters out to sea and shooting them down. In fact, during the Battle of Dunkirk, the RAF lost over 170 planes, whilst the Germans lost 240 aircraft. Many men of the British Expeditionary Force had seen heavy fighting, others had been wounded waiting on the beach to evacuate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was hoping just to get maybe 30 or 40,000 men home, but he succeeded in getting 338,000 men home, including many French who were also saved. During the battle for Dunkirk, the British had lost 3,500 men. They'd also lost 220 ships and over 170 aircraft, as well as 63,000 vehicles and tanks, and over 2,000 heavy guns. The German army suffered 20,000 casualties in the Battle of Dunkirk. They also lost 100 tanks. The French army lost 18,000 men during the fighting around Dunkirk, and when the army finally surrendered, 35,000 men were captured by the German army. These brave French soldiers had done their best to hold off the German army and help the British escape. By the time the German soldiers set foot on Dunkirk beach, the British had gone, and all that was left were piles of their equipment and a few dead British soldiers who never made it home. With great determination, the British Army had managed to snatch a victory from the jaws of certain defeat by saving their army. The troops that went home were welcomed like heroes, much to their surprise. They didn't feel like heroes, but the nation was relieved that the British Army had been saved. Escaping the Germans and surviving to fight another day was seen as a victory in itself. When the French army surrendered on the 22nd of June 1940, Churchill had a huge problem. The French had one of the most powerful navies in the world. Churchill could not let the Germans get their hands on those ships. The French Navy had assured Winston Churchill that they would sink their own ships rather than let them fall into the hands of the Germans. But as time went by, the French showed no signs of sinking their own vessels. Despite French Navy assurances that they would sink their own ships rather than let them fall into the hands of the enemy, Churchill knew that France was now an occupied country, and the Germans could force the French to hand over their ships by threatening the lives of French civilians. Many of the French ships were docked in a French naval base in Algeria. Eventually Churchill sent his own task force to intercept this fleet and to contact them and demand that they either hand over their ships, sink them, or join forces with the British fleet. Winston Churchill knew the south of France had joined forces with the Nazis, and there were a lot of French collaborators, and he could not allow that French fleet to fall into the hands of the German Navy. When the British ships arrived and they made contact with the French vessels, the French didn't take kindly to this British ultimatum. They refused to sink their ships, and they refused to join the Royal Navy fleet. Churchill ordered the French to sink their ships, and if they didn't, he said that they would be sunk by the British fleet. But the French just assumed he was bluffing. Churchill ordered the French would be given time, but if they didn't sink their ships in that time, the British fleet would be ordered to open fire. The French Navy wouldn't follow the orders of Winston Churchill or the Royal Navy. They would only follow the orders of the French government. Unfortunately, the French government was now controlled by the Nazis. As time for the British ultimatum came and went, Churchill, with a heavy heart, ordered the Royal Navy to open fire. The French fleet was trapped in the harbour. They had no room to manoeuvre. It was like shooting rats in a barrel. Once the British started firing, it wasn't long before the French ships were either hit, sunk, or on fire. Over 1,297 French sailors were killed. During the engagement, 350 French sailors were wounded. 3 destroyers were hit, 1 was sunk, 2 were damaged. 3 French battleships were also hit, 2 were badly damaged, and 1 French battleship was also sunk. Only weeks earlier, the French and British had been fighting alongside each other, but now the British were firing on their former allies. The British task force was made up of 17 ships, and they suffered no losses. However, one of their ships was the HMS Hood. It was the most iconic British battleship there was. Sadly, this ship would be sunk by the German battleship Bismarck less than a year later. On top of that, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal would also be sunk in 1941 by a German U-boat. After this incident, there was bad blood between the French and British. Later on, a French U-boat was captured by the British and the crew were forced to surrender, but a Frenchman was killed and 2 British officers were also shot dead in a firefight. Winston Churchill had made a big decision, but that's why he was the Prime Minister. He knew Great Britain were playing for high stakes. France was out of the war, but Great Britain was still in it. By being so ruthless, Churchill also impressed the Americans. They realised that this man was not just going to roll over and surrender to the Germans like the rest of Europe. He would fight and fight to the end. As Great Britain prepared for invasion, they needed every man they could find, including the older generation, who came forward and volunteered to form the new Home Guard. The LDV, or Local Defence Volunteers, or Home Guard, were a group of men who were either too young or too old to fight in the regular army. These men came forward and volunteered for this new force to defend Great Britain from the Nazi invasion. By 1940, equipment was short in the British Army, so these men had no rifles. They trained with broom handles, and at the start they had no uniforms, no helmets, but eventually, as the war went on, they would get the equipment they needed, and they prepared tactics to fight the Nazi invasion. The LDV, or Local Defence Volunteer Force, was basically nothing more than a desperate move by the British Army. They needed men and they needed everyone if they were to repel a Nazi invasion. The British Army had lost all its equipment at Dunkirk. They'd lost 63,000 armoured vehicles and trucks and tanks, and now they had to do the best with what they had left, and they were desperate to build new military vehicles in order to fight the Nazis. But the truth is, they just weren't ready. Despite full military conscription, the British Army didn't have enough men. The German army numbered in its millions, and the British only had a few 100,000 men. They would need to build a bigger army if they were going to stop the German invasion. Unlike Holland and Belgium and France, Great Britain had a huge advantage. They were an island, which meant the Nazis had to cross the Channel, and this gave the British time to build up their forces and prepare for a German invasion. In order to cause maximum confusion for the German army, the British removed signs at stations and they removed signposts for street names, and they also dug in and built pillboxes and anti-tank traps in order to stop the German armour and prepared for the German invasion as best they could. It wasn't long before all British beaches were covered in barbed wire and heavily mined. The British people would turn their island into a fortress. But would it be enough to stop the unbeatable German army? Great Britain had declared war on the 3rd of September 1939. Since then they'd lost in Norway, they'd been defeated in France and at Dunkirk, and now they were preparing for a German invasion. It was Britain's darkest hour, and it was time for Winston Churchill to lead his people, and that's exactly what he did. He talked about fighting the Germans on the beaches, fighting them in the air and in the streets. He said, "We will never surrender." The truth was, Hitler and the Germans expected the British to surrender. They couldn't believe they were prepared to carry on the war. They even tried to get Mussolini to try and negotiate a peace treaty between the British and the Germans. The Germans suggested they would leave Great Britain alone and Britain could have its empire as long as they left Europe in the hands of the German army. But Great Britain and Churchill would never allow that to happen. As more and more working men were called up to the British army, women would eventually have to replace them. They would become bus drivers, tram drivers and factory workers, doing jobs that were traditionally reserved only for the men. The British public came together like never before. They even started collecting old bits of scrap metal, pots and pans, hoping that they could do something with it, maybe give it to the government so they could turn it into bullets or rifles or anything, or tin helmets. Anything that could be used to help the war effort was donated by the people of Great Britain. Of course, much of this scrap metal was totally useless, but the whole operation kept the British people busy, and it stopped them dwelling on the fact that their country was about to be invaded by the German army. After his victory over Europe, back in Germany, Hitler was welcomed like a hero. In the First World War, the machine gun dominated the battlefield, so much so that soldiers had to dig holes in the ground and hide in trenches. This meant that very little ground was taken, and the war degenerated into a stalemate. Battles would go on for months, sometimes almost over a year. And this meant the Germans would suffer 500,000 casualties in just one battle. But by the Second World War, vehicles and tanks were much faster, and the war became much more mobile. And so Hitler and the German army were able to overrun countries like Poland and Holland and Belgium and France in a matter of weeks, suffering very few casualties. This made the people of Germany believe that Hitler was some sort of military genius. Adolf Hitler himself also began to believe in his own military prowess. After their defeat at Dunkirk, the German army expected Great Britain to surrender, but Churchill was talking about fighting on the beaches, so the Germans realised they would have to invade Great Britain. But they had no landing craft, so they had to take ships and convert them into landing craft in order to prepare their invasion force. The German army feared the Royal Navy. However, they knew air power was superior to naval power, and if they could establish air superiority over Great Britain, they could shoot down all the RAF planes, destroy the airfields, and sink any Royal Navy ship, which would allow them to cross the Channel and invade Great Britain. But they would have to establish air superiority in order to do this. This would mean attacking the airfields and knocking out the RAF. However, unlike Poland and France, Great Britain had a secret weapon. It was called radar. During the French campaign, the French fighters didn't know where the German bombers were going, so they had no idea where they were, and by the time they got airborne, the Germans had often destroyed their airfields and were on their way home. But this time, the British would know exactly where the German planes were going, thanks to radar. And not only that, even though they had a smaller air force, they could then use all their planes in the right places at the right time in order to intercept the German fighters. Thanks to radar, whenever the German planes launched a raid, the RAF were there to meet them. Without radar, the British would never have known when the German bombers were about to attack until it was too late. Not only that, with a smaller air force, they just simply wouldn't have had enough planes to cover the entire country. But thanks to radar, they could concentrate their planes where they were needed. Initially, the German bombers concentrated their attacks on British convoys and British shipping in order to try and clear the channel for a German invasion. But thanks to the new invention of radar, the RAF were ready and waiting to take on the Luftwaffe and shoot down the German planes. As Winston Churchill said, the Battle of France was over. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Thanks to radar, the British could work out the size and strength of the German bomber formations. They could then coordinate their squadrons in order to intercept these formations and shoot them down. The Luftwaffe were used to bombing countries like Poland and France, which had no radar, so they never knew when the German bombers were coming. But when they started crossing the Channel and bombing targets in Great Britain, the German planes found themselves being intercepted by British fighters almost every time they crossed the Channel. Great Britain had established the best air defence system in the world. However, Hermann Goering had been given the job of establishing air superiority over Great Britain in preparation for the German invasion, and he assured Hitler he would destroy the RAF. After their easy aerial victories in Poland, Holland, Belgium and France, the Luftwaffe and Goering were overconfident. However, they didn't know about radar, and they had no idea what was waiting for them every time they crossed the Channel. Goering's plan was to attack the airfields. If he destroyed the airfields, then the RAF wouldn't be able to function. However, as wave upon wave of German bombers crossed the Channel, the RAF were there to intercept them. However, the RAF didn't have enough planes to stop all the German bombers, and eventually many of them got through, and before long, a lot of RAF airfields were knocked out and disabled. Week after week the Germans would knock out these airfields, and week after week the British had to rebuild them in order to get their planes back into the air. One of the most effective planes during the French campaign was the Stuka dive bomber. However, this plane was slow and the British had radar, so they could intercept this plane easily. Eventually, the Stukas suffered heavy losses. In fact, the losses were so heavy, the Germans temporarily withdrew the plane from service. But despite radar, the Germans were putting great pressure on the RAF. They were knocking out their airfields faster than they could rebuild them. At this rate, the Germans looked like they were going to establish air superiority. The German Air Force had many aces. They'd served in Poland, they'd served in France, they'd shot down many planes, and they had great fighter pilots. One of the best British fighters was the Hawker Hurricane. It wasn't as fast as the Spitfire, but it was a great gun platform. This plane would take down the German bombers during the Battle of Britain. The Spitfire would take on the fighters, but the Hawker Hurricane would take on the German bombers. The Hurricane had a top speed of 330 miles per hour. It was slower than the Bf-109 and the Spitfire, but it did have 8 machine guns. It may not have been as aerodynamic as the Spitfire or as graceful, but it was a decent gun platform and a robust fighter. The plane was over 9 meters long and had a wingspan of over 12 meters. During the Battle of Britain, it was actually the Hawker Hurricane, not the Spitfire, that shot down the most German planes. The Hawker Hurricane had a rate of climb of 2,780 feet per minute, and it was the most common fighter the British had. The Supermarine Spitfire was the most iconic fighter plane of the Second World War. The plane was just over 9 meters long and had a wingspan of just over 11 meters, and there would be various different versions of the Spitfire throughout the war. During the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was fitted with 8 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. But as the war progressed, the Spitfire would be upgraded with cannons and a faster, more powerful engine. During the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire had a top speed of about 350 miles per hour. But later on in the war, different versions of the Spitfire would have a more powerful engine and its speed would increase. In 1940, the Spitfire and the German Bf 109 were very evenly matched. The Spitfire was more manoeuvrable and it could outturn the German fighter, but the Bf 109, it could outdive the Spitfire. By the end of the war, the Spitfire would have better armour, better weapons and a more powerful engine, and it would eventually be a better fighter than the Bf 109. But in 1940, both these flying machines were evenly matched. In 1940, the Spitfire and the Bf 109 both had similar top speeds. The difference was the Spitfire was a more manoeuvrable plane. It was a dream to fly. It was the perfect flying machine. It was elegant and graceful. The Bf 109 was more practical. However, it had a very small cockpit and the pilots felt cramped. It also had poorer visibility. The biggest disadvantage for the German pilots was they only had 20 minutes over Great Britain before they had to return back to France before they ran out of fuel. On top of that, if a British pilot got shot down, he could be back in a plane before dinner time. But if a German pilot was shot down over Great Britain, he'd be captured and his war would be over. One of the greatest British aces during the Battle of Britain was Douglas Bader. He'd been a pilot before the war, and in 1931 he was flying in an air show when the tip of his wing hit the ground and his plane crashed, and he was seriously injured. Bader survived the crash, but he lost both his legs. They had to be amputated. Back in the 1930s, if you were disabled, you weren't expected to do anything with your life. But Bader wouldn't be deterred. He wanted to fly again, even though he had prosthetic legs. Despite being a talented pilot, nobody wanted Bader because he had no legs. They wanted pilots who were fit and able, and Bader was disabled. But despite being turned down, he persisted until eventually he got himself back in the pilot seat. And it was during the Dunkirk evacuation that Bader shot down his first Bf 109. He also shot down a Heinkel bomber. On the 20th of June 1940, Bader was put in charge of a squadron of Canadian Hurricane pilots, and he had to get them into shape. Initially, the Canadians didn't think much of being given a British officer with no legs, but once Bader got inside a cockpit, he showed the Canadians what he could do, and they were soon impressed. With his perseverance, his strong personality and his determination, Bader soon got the Canadians up and running and turned the 242 squadron into an effective fighting force. With his new Canadian squadron, Bader soon shot down a Dornier 17 and he shot down 2 Bf 110s. Bader had soon become an ace, shooting down 2 more Bf 109s and a Junkers 88. He'd also turned a rabble of Canadian pilots into an elite fighting force. Eventually, Douglas Bader would shoot down 22 enemy planes. And after the Battle of Britain, he flew sorties over France. It was during one of these sorties his plane was hit and he was forced to bail out. Unfortunately, his legs got stuck and he had to leave them behind. When he landed, he was captured by the Germans and taken to a hospital. The Germans were so in awe of this pilot with no legs, they allowed Douglas Bader to get a new set of prosthetic legs sent from England. Once the legs arrived, Douglas Bader put them on in the hospital and then tried to escape. Douglas Bader would become a legend to the people of Great Britain, a hero and one of the greatest aces of the Second World War. During his captivity, Bader would attempt to escape numerous times, causing the Germans as much bother as possible. Eventually, the Germans got so fed up with him trying to escape, they had to threaten to take away his legs. Eventually, Bader was sent to Colditz with all the top British prisoners who tried to escape, and he was eventually liberated on the 16th of April 1945. The main German fighter was the Bf 109. Like the Spitfire, there were many different versions of the Bf 109. During the Battle of Britain, the Germans flew the Bf 109E, which had 2 7.92mm machine guns in each wing and 2 7.92mm machine guns in the nose of the plane. The Bf 109 was a superb fighter. It could outclimb and outdive the Spitfire, but the Spitfire could outturn the Bf 109. It had a tighter turning circle, so the British plane could get behind the Bf 109, so the German pilots used to try to outdive the British Spitfire or outclimb it to avoid being shot down. Both fighters had a similar top speed and were very evenly matched. The Bf 109 was about 8 metres long and had a wingspan of just over 9 metres. It was a small but highly manoeuvrable and deadly plane. Later versions of the Bf 109 would be fitted with a heavy cannon on the wing. As the war went on, the Bf 109 would be fitted with a more powerful engine, which would make it faster and heavier armour. The German plane would keep pace with the Spitfire for the majority of the war, but towards the end of the war, the Spitfire would overtake the Bf 109 and the plane would be less effective in combat. The Bf-109 was the backbone of the German Air Force, but towards the end of the war it would slowly be replaced by the new next-generation German fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190. The Bf-109 was slightly faster than the Spitfire with a top speed of 357 miles per hour. It also had a very advanced fuel injection system which allowed it to outdive the Spitfire. But as the war went on, the Spitfire would be upgraded and eventually it would become the superior plane. The main German bomber was the Heinkel HE-111. It was a standard medium German bomber and it was used throughout the Second World War. The plane was just over 16 metres long and had a wingspan of 22 metres. It also had a crew of 5. The plane had a pilot, a navigator who was also the bombardier and the nose gunner. The plane also had a ventral gunner, a dorsal gunner who was also the radio operator, and a side gunner. The plane also had a top speed of 270 miles per hour. During the Battle of Britain, the bomber was fitted with 7 7.92mm machine guns. 2 machine guns in the nose, 1 dorsal, 2 machine guns in the side, and 2 machine guns in the ventral part of the plane. This gave the bomber decent all-round protection. The Heinkel was designed to be a medium bomber and it could carry 2,000 kilograms of bombs. Hundreds of these planes would be shot down during the Battle of Britain. However, many crews would parachute to safety but end up being captured by the British military. Others would crash in the sea, or end up drowning, or burn to death in their plane. During the Battle of Britain, the Heinkel soaked up a lot of enemy fire, and they often returned with bullet holes all over the fuselage. However, the Heinkel was only a medium bomber, and some believed it didn't carry a big enough bomb load in order to be truly effective during the battle. The Heinkel could also reach an altitude of just over 21,000 feet. The German Air Force also had the Dornier 17, which was nicknamed the Flying Pencil because of its elegant long shape. The plane was just over 15 metres long and it had a wingspan of 18 metres. The plane had a crew of 4 and a top speed of 220 miles per hour. The plane was armed with 6 7.92mm machine guns and could carry a bomb load of 1,000 pounds. The plane could also reach an altitude of 26,000 feet. The Dornier 17 was classed as a twin-engine light German bomber. The German Air Force also had the Bf-110. It was a German fighter bomber. The plane was just over 12 metres long and had a wingspan of just over 16 metres. It also had a maximum top speed of 295 miles per hour. During the war, the plane had 4 7.92mm machine guns and was also fitted with 2 20mm cannons. The plane also had a crew between 2 and 3 people. The Bf-110 had had considerable success during the Polish campaign, and now the Germans were determined to use it during the Battle of Britain. The Germans also had the Stuka dive bomber. This operated with impunity in the Polish and French campaign, but the British had radar, so they could detect when this plane was coming across the channel. The Stuka was slow, and so the British were able to shoot them down very easily. The Stuka was 11.5 metres long with a wingspan of 13.5 metres. The plane had a crew of 2 and a top speed of 255 miles per hour. It was also armed with 3 7.92mm machine guns, 2 forward-firing machine guns and 1 rear-firing machine gun. During the Battle of Britain, the Stuka suffered such significant losses the Germans withdrew it temporarily from combat. The plane was a superb dive bomber, but it was no match for the British fighters. The German Air Force never built a heavy bomber. But to be fair, it didn't look like they needed one. They conquered the whole of Europe with just a medium bomber. They beat Poland and France without any heavy bombers. But when they conquered Europe, the Germans also had ground forces. But now they were being asked to beat Great Britain with just their air power. The pilots of the RAF and the German Luftwaffe would face each other one-on-one in deadly dogfights over the skies of Great Britain. These aerial duels were considered more chivalrous and more heroic in many ways than the dirty ground fighting. Many German pilots considered themselves chivalrous knights of the sky. Many British pilots were just young boys who'd had a few hours training in a Spitfire or a Hurricane before they were expected to take on the German Air Force. These boys had hardly any training and were no match for the experienced aces of the Luftwaffe who'd served in Poland and France. Fortunately, Great Britain did have some experienced and brilliant pilots. These men lived a devil-may-care cavalier lifestyle. They sat round being bored, reading newspapers, playing chess or playing football, until the alarm bell went, and then they were expected to get into their cockpit, take off, and shoot down the German planes. Every time these men took to the skies, they never knew which one of them might not be coming back. Radar would pick up the size and location of the German formations, detecting how many bombers and fighters there were. They would then pass that information on to the RAF. They would scramble their fighter pilots, who would get into the cockpits, take to the skies, and intercept the German planes. Once the RAF intercepted the German formations, the Spitfires would take on the escorting Bf-109 escort fighters, and the Hurricanes would try and shoot down the bombers. Aerial combat could be brutal. Men got trapped in planes that caught on fire and burnt to death. Other men crashed into the sea. Some pilots bailed out, but their parachutes didn't open, and they fell hundreds of feet to the ground. Some planes just exploded in midair, killing the pilot instantly. The Battle of Britain would last from the 10th of July 1940 to the 31st of October. Both sides suffered heavy casualties during the battle, but thanks to radar, the German bomber formations were devastated. It seemed like every time they launched an attack and crossed the channel, there was a British squadron waiting parked behind the nearest cloud. On the 18th of August, the British lost 34 fighters. 29 were destroyed on the ground, and 5 were shot down, and 10 pilots were killed. On the same day, the Germans lost 71 aircraft. 94 men were killed and 40 of them were captured. The 18th of August would become known as the hardest day, but the British were able to destroy twice as many German aircraft. One of the many heroes of the Battle of Britain was Sergeant James "Ginger" Lacey. He was a trainee pharmacist from Leeds who joined the RAF in 1937. His first kill was on the 20th of July 1940, where he shot down an enemy plane. By August 1940, he'd shot down 6 enemy planes and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. After that, he shot down another 6 planes. On the 13th of September, he shot down a Heinkel bomber that had just bombed Buckingham Palace. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he'd shot down 18 enemy planes. One of Britain's greatest aces during the Battle of Britain was Flight Lieutenant Eric Locke. He would shoot down 22 German aircraft. His first confirmed kill was a Bf-110, and then he shot down a Junkers 88. On one day he shot down a Heinkel 111, but then he was hit in the leg by a German Bf-109. But he managed to turn the tables on the German fighter and returned fire, and the Bf-109 exploded. Despite being wounded in the leg, he shot down a second Heinkel bomber over the English Channel. He watched the German pilots bail out, and he actually led a ship to the crash site so the German pilots could be rescued and picked up. Despite the wound in his leg, he flew the very next day and shot down a Junkers 88 over the coast of Dover. On the 14th of September, he shot down a Bf-109, and on the same day he shot down a Dornier 17. The next day he shot down 2 more Bf-109s, and eventually he scored 8 kills in less than 7 days. By the end of the Battle of Britain, he'd shot down 22 German planes in his Supermarine Spitfire. After the Battle of Britain on the 3rd of August 1941, Locke was flying over occupied France and he was attacking a German convoy. As he flew low, he was hit by ground fire and his Spitfire was shot down and destroyed. He was killed instantly. His body was never recovered, but by the time of his death, Locke had 26 confirmed enemy kills. He was one of Britain's greatest aces of the Second World War. On the 7th of October 1940, squadron leader Archibald McKellar shot down 5 Bf-109 fighters in a single day. On another day, he shot down 3 Heinkel bombers with a single 12-second burst of fire. During his time in the RAF, McKellar flew Spitfires and Hurricanes, and he was an inspirational leader to his men, and by the end of the Battle of Britain, he had 21 confirmed kills. McKellar was said to have exceptional eyesight, which made him a brilliant fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. Sadly, on the 1st of November 1940, McKellar's Hurricane was hit, and he was shot down by German ace Captain Wolfgang Lippert. His plane crashed into the ground and he was killed instantly. During the first few weeks of the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe concentrated their bombing on the British airfields. But during a British raid on Germany, the British dropped bombs on Berlin, and Hitler was furious. He said if one British bomb fell on Berlin, he would drop hundreds of thousands of bombs on London. Hitler was so enraged the British dared bomb Berlin that he decided to level London. He ordered the German Luftwaffe to switch targets. Instead of bombing airfields, they were to start bombing London instead. This would prove to be a huge tactical mistake, because by bombing London and switching targets, the Germans were now taking pressure off the British airfields, and the British had time to rebuild their airfields, and that meant they could carry on fighting the Germans. By bombing Berlin, the British had made Hitler so angry he'd now decided to change his plan tactically, and he was bombing London instead of bombing the airfields, and this would be a disastrous mistake for the Germans. During the German Blitz on London, over 40,000 civilians would be killed. Firemen would risk their lives trying to put out fires started by German incendiary bombs in order to save the city from burning down. People didn't just lose family members and loved ones, they lost their houses. Hundreds of people had their homes destroyed during the London bombing campaign by the Germans. In fact, many people thought it was safer to sleep in the London Underground rather than stay in their own house. So at night, the London Underground became packed full of people, desperate to shelter from the German bombs. And it wasn't just London. Manchester, Coventry, Bristol, many cities were hit by German bombs during the Blitz. Initially, the German bombers targeted the docks and warehouses, trying to destroy British infrastructure and weaken the British resolve. Night after night, fires would rage across London, and even St Paul's Cathedral almost burnt to the ground. Buckingham Palace was also damaged. But once again, the British people came together like never before, and the spirit of the Blitz began. The rest of the world watched on with admiration as Great Britain held out against the German war machine. After waiting to see which way the war was going, Italian dictator Mussolini had also joined forces with the Nazis. He also declared war against Great Britain, and Great Britain stood alone. Great Britain may have stood alone, but the great British public stood together. Rescue teams worked day and night to dig people out of the rubble and saving many lives. But the waves of German bombers kept coming, and London was pounded again and again, night after night, day after day. But bombing London had given the RAF time to repair their airfields, and now they were back to full strength, ready to take on the German bombers. During the Battle of Britain, the RAF lost over 1,500 planes, but the German Air Force lost over 2,000. The RAF lost over 1,500 men, but the German Air Force lost over 2,500. Over 900 of their pilots were also captured. Of the 1,500 RAF men killed, most of them were killed on the ground during German bombing raids, and 544 British pilots were shot down and killed. But the Germans lost 2,500. By the end of October, it was obvious the German Air Force had failed to establish air superiority, and the RAF had won the Battle of Britain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself said, "Never in the field of human conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few." Great Britain had inflicted the first defeat on the German war machine, and Hitler could not invade Great Britain because he'd failed to establish air superiority. After his failure in the Battle of Britain, Hitler had to put his invasion plans on hold. However, the German Luftwaffe would continue bombing British cities at night. But despite these non-stop raids, night after night, the spirit of the British people astonished the world. No matter how many raids there were, no matter how many bombs the Germans dropped, no matter how many people died, the British public carried on as normal. The great British bulldog fighting spirit was born amidst the blitz of the German air raids. As Winston Churchill had said, these people would not be beaten. The bravery and fighting spirit of the British public was nothing short of miraculous. Night after night, the people of London would cram themselves into the underground stations and waited as the Germans bombed their houses above. These people would take everything the Luftwaffe would throw at them. If Hitler was determined to break the spirits of the people of Great Britain, he had failed. Despite the huge loss of life and the destruction of cities like Coventry, Great Britain carried on. Goering and the German Luftwaffe had failed to break the spine of Great Britain, and they'd failed to destroy the spirits of the British people. Not since the Great Fire of London had the city seen such devastation. Despite the indomitable spirit of the British public, the rest of the world watched on, asking how long could they carry on enduring this type of devastation. The heroes weren't just the pilots, they were the firemen, the ambulance workers, the air raid wardens. Everyone pulled together to help dig people out of the rubble and save lives. Winston Churchill understood the British public. He said they wouldn't surrender, and he was right. The whole country would pull together in a way never seen before or since. A national spirit was created, the spirit of the Blitz. The British public weren't about to let the Nazis and Adolf Hitler push them around. Despite the German bombs, despite rationing and food shortages, the British public carried on as if there wasn't a war going on at all. Everyone was in it together, even the royal family. After Buckingham Palace was bombed by the Germans, the royals got great sympathy from the British public. It also proved no matter what your station in life, nobody was immune to the damage and destruction of this war. During the Blitz, King George and the Queen became more popular than ever. They became iconic figures, a symbol of the great British public's defiance. But the biggest symbol of the great British public's defiance was Winston Churchill himself. His relentless energy, his bulldog fighting spirit, his courage, and his determination and his defiance of Adolf Hitler had made him a star in the eyes of the British public. This is the man they put their faith in. This was the man who was going to lead them to victory over the Nazis, no matter what the odds. Churchill would visit the most devastated parts of London, and he would show the V for Victory sign everywhere he went. He knew the British public was scared, and they were desperate to believe in something, and he wanted them to believe in victory. And they did. They believed in victory, and they believed in him. Despite losing homes and families and friends and children, the people of Great Britain never gave up hope. They believed they could still win this war. But the British resolve, the British faith would be tested by the Nazis to the limit. Day after day, week after week, night after night, the bombs kept falling. It seemed like the firemen of London had an impossible task, trying to save their city from being completely destroyed by the German war machine. The German Air Force would drop incendiary bombs designed to set the entire city of London on fire. If the British public wanted it to stop, all they had to do was surrender to Germany. But they wouldn't. On the 29th of December 1940, the German bombers started a firestorm in the heart of London, but the British firefighters managed to save St Paul's Cathedral from being burned to the ground. Benito Mussolini was the dictator of Italy. He was known as El Duce, which meant the boss. Like Adolf Hitler, Mussolini had had a similar rise to power. Like Adolf Hitler, Mussolini was a prominent political figure. He was also a member of the Italian National Socialist Party. He'd also served time in prison, like Adolf Hitler, for denouncing the government. And like Adolf Hitler, he would also attempt to seize power by force. For many years, Mussolini was an important political journalist before he attempted to seize power. He also became the template for the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler was inspired by Mussolini. Because of his views, eventually Mussolini was thrown out of the National Socialist Party. But thanks to his journalism, he already had a large following in Italy. Like Adolf Hitler, Mussolini would also serve his country in the First World War, and his destiny would be shaped by that conflict. Just like Germany in the 1920s, Italy was a battleground of political views, and Mussolini would use this chaos to rise to the top. Mussolini, like Hitler, was a great speaker. He made brilliant speeches, and he started his own national fascist Italian party. Benito Mussolini's Italian fascist party, his black shirts were unlike anything Italy had ever seen before. They were revolutionary in their politics, and to the Italian people, Benito Mussolini portrayed himself as a macho man of action who would rebuild the Roman Empire and make Italy great again. On the 28th of October 1922, 30,000 black shirts marched to Rome and demanded the Prime Minister resign. The Prime Minister of Italy wanted to declare martial law, but the King of Italy had supreme power, and he ordered the Prime Minister to resign and handed power to Mussolini and his fascist blackshirts. After taking power, Mussolini attempted to make Italy great again. He made the trains run on time, and he also inspired the Italian national football team to win the World Cup on home soil in 1934. Italy's 1934 World Cup win on home soil was overshadowed by corruption, because Benito Mussolini had had dinner with the referee before Italy's semi-final and before the World Cup final itself. Many people believed Benito Mussolini had bribed the ref. This controversy overshadowed the World Cup. In fact, many people believed it wasn't FIFA that hosted this tournament, but Mussolini himself. But under Benito Mussolini, Italy had become disciplined and strong as a country. However, the fascist party ruled with violence and fear and intimidation. Adolf Hitler was so impressed by Mussolini and his fascist party that he used them as inspiration for his own Nazi party. Eventually, Mussolini and Hitler would become good friends. But when Hitler went to war with Poland, Holland, Belgium and France and Great Britain, Mussolini wasn't interested in getting involved. But as Adolf Hitler defeated France and Great Britain, Mussolini realised Hitler was about to conquer Europe. He saw this as an opportunity, and he joined forces with the Nazis and immediately declared war on Great Britain. Benito Mussolini saw which way the war was going, and he wanted his piece of the action. Benito Mussolini saw the Italian people as the descendants of the old Roman Empire, and he wanted to build a new Roman Empire. However, the Germans controlled Europe, but Benito Mussolini realised he could build his new empire in North Africa. But in order to build a new Italian empire in Africa, Benito Mussolini needed to get rid of the old British Empire first. Even before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Italians had had a strong military presence in North Africa for years, ever since the 1930s when they attempted to colonise Libya and parts of North Africa. They also committed terrible atrocities in Ethiopia. In 1935 to 1937, under Benito Mussolini's reign, the Italians had attacked and invaded Ethiopia, waging a genocidal war against its native people. The Italians had a strong military presence in North Africa, and Benito Mussolini ordered that the Italian army drive the British out. Under General Wavell, the British forces had carried out a few early raids against the Italians, but thanks to a lack of equipment, they were forced on the defensive. The British controlled Egypt, and Cairo was seen as the gateway to the oil fields of the Middle East. After the failure of the Battle of Britain, the Germans had to put their invasion plans on hold. And in September, Mussolini ordered the Italian army to advance across the desert. Initially, General Wavell ordered the British forces to retreat. He wanted to get the Italian army to stretch their supply lines as far as possible before counter-attacking. The British army would attack the Italians, then quickly fall back, and the Italian army would carry on advancing. The British would keep harassing them this way as they advanced across the desert. One of the main Italian battle tanks was the M1340. The tank had 30mm of frontal armour, but the armour on the sides was only 25mm thick, but the armour around the turret was 42mm thick. However, the tank could easily be destroyed by any British anti-tank gun or any British tank. The tank had a 47mm gun in the turret, and it also had a number of highly unreliable Breda machine guns. The tank also had an underpowered engine and could reach a top speed of 19 miles per hour. The Italian army had no heavy or medium tanks. All their tanks were light tanks. And they were no match for the likes of the British Matilda Mark II. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Italian army was unfortunately their armour. It just wasn't up to the task. The Italians also had the M11-39 tank. This tank had a 37mm gun and two 8mm Breda machine guns. The tank had 30mm of frontal armour, but the armour on the side was only 14mm thick, and the armour at the rear was only 8mm thick. The tank was just over 2 metres wide and just over 4 metres long, and had a top speed of 20 miles per hour. It also had a major design flaw. The main gun was fitted into the body of the tank instead of the turret. The main Italian battle rifle was the M1891, but by 1938 the Italians made a shorter version called the M1891-38. The Italian army had a longer 7.35mm version, but they also had this 6.5mm shorter barreled version. The rifle could be equipped with a bayonet, and it was also equipped with an internal 6-round box magazine. During the Second World War, the Italians would also go back to using the longer barreled version of the M1891 rifle. Fitted with a sniper scope, this bolt-action rifle had a range up to 1,000 meters. The Italian army also used the Beretta 1938 machine gun. It was basically a more modern version of an Italian machine gun used in the First World War. The gun had a poor rate of fire. It could fire up to 200 rounds a minute and had a maximum range of about 200 meters. The weapon could be fitted with a range of magazines that could hold up to 10, 20, 30 or even 40 rounds. Compared to other machine guns of the era, this gun was quite dated. During the Second World War, the Italians would also use a machine gun from 1918. The Beretta 1918 had a detachable 25-round magazine and was quite dated by the start of the Second World War. The Italian army also had the Beretta light machine gun. The Beretta machine gun was a highly ineffective weapon. If the magazine got damaged, the weapon could become obsolete. The magazine only held 20 rounds, which was highly ineffective. The weapon had a rate of fire of 500 rounds a minute, but with such a small magazine, that wouldn't last long. The weapon also looked very rickety, and because of that, the recoil was horrendous, making aiming practically impossible. The main Italian sidearm was the Beretta 1938. It had a 7-round magazine and was a decent Italian pistol. British General Archibald Wavell wanted to stretch Italian supply lines, so he allowed the Italians to advance, capturing meaningless desert. He kept retreating until his forces were ready, and then he decided to counterattack. On the 7th of December 1940, the RAF launched a raid and destroyed 39 Italian planes on the ground, as the British then launched their counterattack. After being defeated by Germany in Norway and France, the British Army had something to prove, and they immediately attacked, and after fierce fighting, they destroyed the Italians, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment quickly attacked and destroyed 2 Italian fortresses, and thousands of Italian prisoners started to surrender. The Italian army were used to fighting poorly trained, poorly equipped natives in North Africa. They weren't used to taking on the well-trained, well-equipped, and well-disciplined British army. Mussolini's dream of a new Italian empire was gone. His delusion that Italian people were somehow related to the ancient Romans had been destroyed. The British advance would drive the Italians all the way back to Libya, and along the way the British would take tens of thousands of prisoners. From the 9th of December to the 11th of December, the British took 38,000 prisoners. They captured 237 Italian heavy guns. They also captured 73 Italian tanks and 1,000 Italian vehicles, and the British only lost 624 men. The British Army had also captured every Italian fortification from Sidi Barrani to Tobruk. After initial fighting, the Italian army crumbled in the face of the British Army. By the end of 1940 and the start of January 1941, the British had captured over 133,000 Italian prisoners. This was a total humiliation to Benito Mussolini, and it proved to Hitler that the Italians were weak allies. Great Britain may have been fighting Germany and Italy alone, but it did have an empire, and it could call on troops from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and India. In fact, during the Battle of Baradi, the Australians had suffered over 400 casualties and the British had lost 17 tanks. But the Italians had 40,000 casualties and lost 130 tanks in the same battle. During this North African campaign, the Italians had lost 420 tanks and 845 heavy guns, and over 133,000 Italians had been taken prisoner. On the 28th of October 1940, Mussolini decided to expand his empire by invading Greece through Albania. But just like North Africa, things didn't go according to plan, and the Italian army soon got bogged down in fighting against the Greeks. Thanks to air support from the RAF, the Greeks were able to stop the Italian invasion, and hold them off and even counterattack, and eventually things degenerated into a stalemate. In the end, the British government decided to send troops into Greece. Unfortunately, so did the Germans. On the 6th of April 1941, the German army invaded Yugoslavia, and they invaded Greece. Greece had held out against the Italians, but they were no match for the German army. Yugoslavia would eventually surrender to the Germans, and Greece would hold out for 2 months before being overwhelmed. As well as the German and Italian army, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria also joined forces with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and they would become part of the Axis forces. Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria would also send troops into Yugoslavia and Greece and support the German attack. Yugoslavia and Greece soon surrendered, and Great Britain found itself on its own again, facing Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy and Germany. During the battle for Greece, the Italians suffered 20,000 dead and 63,000 wounded. The Germans lost just over 7,000 men. The Greek army had 13,000 dead and 42,000 wounded. They also had 270,000 men taken prisoner. The Greeks expected the Germans to attack through Albania, so they took units away from the Yugoslavian border to try and stop the Germans. However, the Germans surprised them by attacking through Yugoslavia itself. During the invasion of Yugoslavia, the German army only lost 151 men who were killed. Within a week, they had overrun Yugoslavia, capturing the capital Belgrade, inflicting thousands of casualties. During the battle for Yugoslavia, Italy had lost 800 men and Hungary lost 120. Of the 52,000 British soldiers fighting in Greece, 13,000 were captured and just over 900 were killed. But the rest managed to escape before Greece surrendered. During the Greek campaign, the Allies had 500,000 men, but the Germans had 1,200,000. The Axis forces had 1,200 tanks, the Allies only had 100. After their victory over Greece and Yugoslavia, on the 20th of May 1941, the Germans invaded Crete. The German army used their elite paratroopers, and they took the British completely by surprise. These men landed and attacked the British troops guarding the airfields. The German paratroopers were an elite fighting force, but the British troops fought heroically. The fighting was intense and ferocious, but the British tried to hold back the German paratroopers for as long as they could. Many British soldiers held their position until eventually they were killed. Once the German paratroopers took the airfields, they could then fly in reinforcements. Once they did, the British found themselves outnumbered. The year before, in 1940, the British army had defeated the Italians when they tried to invade Crete, but this time they were up against the German army and the elite German paratroopers. Despite this, the British fought magnificently. In fact, the German 1st Assault Regiment had 400 men killed out of 600 on the first day. The Germans would suffer severe casualties in the opening days of the battle. At one point, armed Greek civilians and Greek police were able to rout and push back a German attack. After heavy fighting, the New Zealand 22nd Regiment had to withdraw from Hill 107, which left one of the airfields undefended, and the Germans eventually took control of it. After losing the airfield, the British tried to retake it using a counterattack, but they were unsuccessful. Once the Germans had control of an airfield, they could fly in reinforcements, and soon the British force would find themselves outnumbered and surrounded, trapped in Crete. The Germans also tried to land reinforcements on Crete using ships. Thankfully, the Royal Navy were there to protect the island, and they managed to attack the German fleet, sinking a number of their transport ships and forcing them to retreat. As more German paratroopers landed, eventually the airfield was overrun and the Germans could call in more reinforcements. Before long, the British garrison on Crete was trapped with no way to escape. During the battle for Crete, over 3,500 British soldiers were killed. 500 Greek civilians were also executed, murdered by the German forces. Within 13 days, the battle was over, and the remaining British forces finally surrendered. Despite their victory over the Italian army in North Africa, the British army had been defeated by the Germans in Norway, France, Greece, and now Crete. To make matters worse, after his defeat in North Africa, Benito Mussolini had asked Adolf Hitler for help, and Hitler sent a small force of German soldiers to North Africa under the command of his best general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel was told by Hitler just to hold his position, but he disobeyed orders and immediately went on the counter-attack. And he ended up capturing the British general, General O'Connor. Rommel had defeated the British before at Arras in France, and now he'd beaten them again. Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps would become legendary. He succeeded in defeating the British and driving them back across the desert. There was no doubt that General Rommel had saved the Italian army from certain defeat in North Africa. 1940 to 1941 had been a tough year for Great Britain. They'd lost in Norway, they'd lost in France, they'd had to evacuate at Dunkirk, but they had escaped and inflicted the first defeat on the Germans in the Battle of Britain and saved themselves from invasion. They'd also defeated the Italian army in North Africa and driven them back across the desert. But now they'd also been defeated again by the Germans in Greece and Crete, and Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps were beating the British again in the desert. And now Great Britain wasn't just at war with Germany, they were at war with their allies, Italy, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria and Finland. On top of all this, London was being destroyed by German bombs night after night. And by the end of 1941, the Japanese would declare war on Great Britain by attacking their bases in the Far East. It had been a tough year for Great Britain, but despite defeats and disasters, they were still fighting.